Germany 7-1 Brazil. Belo Horizonte, 2014. This was intended to be a coronation. Brazil, the spiritual home of football, was hosting the World Cup, and the nation had turned the stadium into a sea of yellow, weeping during the anthem with religious fervour. The narrative was pre-written. The hosts would overcome the loss of Neymar to lift the trophy. But within 20 minutes, the sport of football seemed to completely fall apart. The German goals came with ruthless speed. Everything we knew about these teams vanished. Between the 23rd and 29th minutes, the German team scored 4 goals in a blur of brutal efficiency that resembled a training drill against mannequins. The scoreboard ticked over to 5-0 before most fans in the stadium could even process the second goal. The visceral details of that half hour remain haunting. The atmosphere in the Mineirão turned toxic fast. 60,000 fans went from screaming the national anthem to staring in total disbelief as Germany put 5 past them in the first half hour. Sami Khedira and Toni Kroos passed the ball with surgical indifference, dismantling the Brazilian defence as if they were ghosts. It was a massacre that defied professional logic. Years later, the scoreline 7-1 feels less like a match result and more like a typing error in the history books. To this day, it is remembered as the moment the most famous football nation on earth simply forgot how to play. The headbutt. The 2006 World Cup final was scripted to be the glorious swan song of Zinedine Zidane, the greatest artist of his generation. He had already scored a Panenka penalty earlier in the match, playing with a serene, absolute confidence. As the game dragged into the fatigue of extra time, the world awaited a final moment of magic or a penalty shootout. The cameras were following the ball elsewhere when play suddenly stopped. The referee blew his whistle, not for a foul, but for a body lying on the turf. The confusion was absolute. There was no VAR, no stadium replay. Fans had no idea why Marco Materazzi was writhing on the ground. Then, the broadcast showed the angle that shocked the world. It wasn't a tackle at all. It was an act of cold, deliberate violence. Zidane, calm and deliberate, had turned and driven his head into Materazzi's chest. It was shocking. 1 minute, he's jogging back. The next, he's floored Materazzi. It didn't make any sense. The image of Zidane walking past the Golden World Cup trophy, head bowed, unlacing his gloves as he disappeared into the dark tunnel, is still considered the most haunting visual in football history. He didn't just lose his temper, he shattered his own fairy tale ending. It was a stark, brutal reminder that even gods are capable of human flaws, ending a legendary career not with a goal, but with a red card. The Danish fairy tale. Modern football is defined by meticulous preparation, data analysis, and diet regimes. The story of Denmark in 1992 flips this entirely on its head, playing out like a rejected movie script. The Danish team had not even qualified for the tournament. They were technically on vacation, scattered across the beaches of southern Europe, when civil war disqualified Yugoslavia. With barely a week's notice, the players were recalled from their holidays to compete against the most finely tuned squads on the continent. The illusion was that they would be cannon fodder, a team lacking fitness, strategy, or focus. Instead, they played with a liberated spirit that baffled their opponents. They scraped through the group stages before facing the reigning European champions, the Netherlands, and the world champions, Germany. Logic dictated they stood no chance. Yet, in the final, against a unified, powerful German side, Denmark didn't just survive. They dominated. John Jensen, a midfielder who rarely scored, fired a thunderbolt into the net. Peter Schmeichel seemed to grow physically larger in the goal, repelling every German attack. When the final whistle blew, the image of players who had been drinking cocktails 2 weeks prior, lifting the trophy, shattered the professional seriousness of the sport. It stands as the ultimate exception proof that sometimes chemistry and relaxation can dismantle the most sophisticated footballing systems in the world. Zambia. The 2012 African Cup of Nations final carried a weight far heavier than a standard sporting event. In 1993, the entire Zambian national team perished in a plane crash off the coast of Libreville, Gabon, wiping out a golden generation. 19 years later, by a twist of fate that feels almost too poetic, the 2012 final was held in Libreville, just miles from the crash site. Zambia, a team of journeymen, faced the Ivory Coast, a super team featuring Didier Drogba and Yaya Toure. The talent gap was astronomical. The atmosphere was thick with history. The Ivory Coast was vastly superior, yet they could not score. Didier Drogba, one of the world's most lethal strikers, skied a penalty in regulation time. The ball seemed to be repelled by an invisible force. The match drifted into a penalty shootout that defied all statistical probability, going deep into sudden death. When Stoppala Sunzu scored the winning penalty, the celebrations were defined less by pure joy and more by an heavy, eerie sense of closure. The Zambian players fell to their knees, singing to the ocean where their predecessors had died. It felt as though the spirits of the 1993 team had physically intervened to guide the ball. In a sport governed by money and tactics, this was a rare moment where the story felt more important than the sport, delivering a victory that seemed guided by the ghosts of the past. The Hand of the Devil, Johannesburg, 2010. The game was following a perfect script. Ghana was on the verge of becoming the first African nation to reach a World Cup semi-final, playing on African soil. With the score tied 1-1 in the dying seconds of extra time, Dominic Adiyia headed the ball toward an empty net. The goal was certain. The history books were open. Then Luis Suarez chose to burn the script. He stopped the ball with a blatant, two-handed goalkeeper's parry, a cynical, calculated trade of a red card for a 1% chance of survival. What followed was a brutal twist of fate. Suarez was sent off, weeping as he walked to the tunnel. Asamoah Gyan stood over the penalty kick, the last kick of the game. If he scored, justice would be served. Instead, the ball smashed against the crossbar with a metallic clang that silenced an entire continent. The camera immediately cut to the tunnel, where Suarez, seeing the miss, exploded into jubilant celebration. He had cheated destiny and won. The penalty shootout that followed was a mere formality. Ghana was psychologically destroyed. Watching Suarez carried around the field on his teammates' shoulders afterward felt like a subversion of justice, a moment where the villain broke the rules in plain sight and was rewarded with the ultimate prize. The St. James's Park collapse, February 2011. For the first 26 minutes, Arsenal played football from a different dimension. They were 4-0 up against Newcastle United before fans had even finished their first halftime pie. The gap in quality was so vast it felt like professionals bullying amateurs. Newcastle fans were streaming out of the exits, choosing the cold rush of the Tyne over the humiliation on the pitch. The statistical probability of a draw at that moment was effectively zero. The fracture began in the 68th minute. A red card for Abu Diaba shifted the atmosphere, but a 3-goal comeback still felt impossible. Then panic set in. Newcastle scored once, then twice. By the 83rd minute, it was 4-3, and the Arsenal players were visibly trembling, completely paralysed by the pressure. The climax arrived in the 87th minute. A cleared ball dropped from the sky toward Sheikh Tiote. He struck a left-footed volley so pure it seemed laser-guided, screaming through a forest of legs into the bottom corner. 4-4. The stadium noise registered as physical pain. Arsenal suffered a mental collapse so severe it became the benchmark for bottling in the Premier League. Blowing a 4-goal lead in 20 minutes is unforgivable at this level. Arsenal completely fell apart, a Shakespearean tragedy. The irony of this moment is almost too heavy for real life. April 2014. Liverpool was on an 11-game winning streak, destined to win their first league title in 24 years. The captain, Steven Gerrard, the local hero, the club legend, had gathered his team on the pitch weeks earlier, shouting the now infamous line, "We do not let this slip." It was the rallying cry of the season. Against a weakened Chelsea team that had nothing to play for, Liverpool just needed a draw to keep control. In first half stoppage time, tragedy struck. Mamadou Sakho played a simple pass to Gerrard near the halfway line. Simple. Routine. But Gerrard's footing gave way. He slipped. Demba Ba, lurking like a villain in the shadows, raced through on goal. No defenders, just the sprawling figure of the captain chasing in vain. Ba scored. The silence at Anfield was heavy with the realisation of what had just happened. The man who promised not to let it slip had literally slipped to lose the title. It was a cruel twist of fate. Of all people to make that mistake, it had to be the captain who'd carried them all season. 20 seconds of madness. In the high-stakes theatre of English football, the Championship playoff semi-final is notoriously cruel, but the conclusion of the 2013 match at Vicarage Road stands out as perhaps the sport's most surreal sequence. With the aggregate score tied in the 97th minute, Leicester City was awarded a controversial penalty. The narrative seemed set. Anthony Knockaert would score, send Leicester to Wembley, and end Watford's season. The stadium held its breath, resigning itself to a heartbreaking defeat. Then, in a span of 20 seconds, the entire atmosphere of the stadium flipped completely. That final minute was absolute chaos. Manuel Almunia didn't just save the penalty, he saved the rebound, a double intervention that kept Watford on life support. But the true chaos started in the transition. Instead of clearing the ball, Watford launched a desperate, lung-busting counter-attack. The ball travelled from Cassetti to Anya, then a looped cross to the back post, where Jonathan Hogg knocked it down. Troy Deeney, arriving like a freight train, smashed the volley into the net. In a blur of frantic action, the game shifted from a potential Leicester winner to a Watford goal. In 20 seconds, Leicester went from guaranteed finalists to eliminated, while Watford fans spilled onto the pitch in a massive wave of disbelief. To watch the replay is to witness sport at its most cruel and euphoric. One moment, Leicester had a penalty to win it, and 20 seconds later, Deeney is smashing a volley into the net at the other end to send the home crowd into a frenzy. The Camp Nou miracle. The premise of the second leg was mathematically absurd. Paris Saint-Germain had demolished Barcelona 4-0 in France, a lead that, historically, was insurmountable. No team in Champions League history had ever overturned a 4-goal deficit. As the clock ticked past the 87th minute, Barcelona still required 3 goals to advance. The atmosphere in the Camp Nou was one of sombre acceptance. The players looked exhausted, and the fans were preparing for an honourable exit. Then, the match shifted in a way that felt almost impossible to explain. The spark came from a Neymar free kick in the 88th minute, a moment of individual brilliance that initially seemed like a consolation. But panic is a contagious force. When Luis Suarez won a penalty moments later, the PSG players visibly froze, paralysed by the sudden shift in momentum. Neymar scored again, 5-1. They still needed one more. In the dying seconds of stoppage time, with goalkeeper Marc-Andre ter Stegen playing as a midfielder, a desperate chip found Sergi Roberto. His toe-poke finish triggered a roar so loud it literally registered on a local seismometer as a micro-earthquake. 3 goals in 7 minutes. It was a sequence where logic, tactics, and time management simply stopped mattering. When the final whistle blew, the PSG players just dropped. They looked shell-shocked, like they couldn't process what had just happened. It proved that at the Camp Nou, the word impossible doesn't really apply. 3 minutes in Barcelona. For 89 minutes, the 1999 Champions League final was a masterclass in German efficiency. Bayern Munich had scored early through Mario Basler and spent the rest of the match strangling the life out of Manchester United. The trophy was literally being decorated with Bayern's ribbons on the sideline. The narrative was sealed. The Germans had been the superior team, hitting the woodwork twice and controlling the tempo. But as the fourth official raised the board for 3 minutes of stoppage time, the entire world seemed to turn upside down. It wasn't just a comeback, it was a complete, instantaneous reversal of fortune. In the 91st minute, Teddy Sheringham scuffed a shot into the corner. The equaliser was shocking enough. Yet the universe wasn't finished. Less than 100 seconds later, Ole Gunnar Solskjaer stuck out a boot at a flicked-on corner, redirecting the ball into the roof of the net. The visual aftermath is what haunts the memory. Bayern defender Samuel Kufu collapsed to the turf, beating the ground with his fists in pure, unfiltered despair. The Bayern players were absolutely shattered. Kufu was pounding the ground in frustration, and the rest of them could barely pick themselves up to take the kickoff. To turn a 1-0 defeat into a 2-1 victory in the time it takes to boil a kettle stands as the most unbelievable ending in the history of club football. Roberto Carlos's banana kick. Leon, 1997. The match was a meaningless exhibition, a warm-up for the World Cup. But in the 21st minute, Roberto Carlos stepped up to a free kick 35 yards from goal and seemingly broke the laws of aerodynamics. The setup was absurd. He placed the ball, took a run-up that started in a different postcode, and struck it with the outside of his left boot. To the naked eye, the shot was a failure. It was heading yards wide of the post, destined for the corner flag. Then, the ball took a path that didn't seem possible. In midair, the ball encountered a pocket of turbulence that didn't make sense. It slowed down and violently swerved inward, correcting its path by nearly 15 degrees in a split second. Fabien Barthez, the French goalkeeper, didn't even dive. He stood frozen, watching the ball clip the post and nestle into the net, assuming it had gone wide until the crowd roared. Physics professors later wrote papers on the Magnus effect to explain the trajectory, but watching the replay looks less like a physics demonstration and more like a magic trick. It's the greatest free kick of all time. The swerve on the ball was ridiculous. It was heading for the corner flag before it curled in. Beckham versus Greece. Old Trafford, 2001. The narrative for England was bleak, trailing 2-1 to Greece in stoppage time. They were facing the humiliation of missing automatic World Cup qualification. The team played with fear, their legs heavy, their minds broken. But David Beckham, a man vilified by his own nation just 3 years prior, decided to play a different sport entirely. For 93 minutes, he had run nearly 16 kilometres, demanding the ball, taking every corner, every throw-in, seemingly fighting 11 Greek players alone. The defining moment arrived in the 93rd minute. England won a free kick. It was the last kick of the game. The stadium fell into a hush that felt almost religious. Beckham stepped up. He struck the ball with a perfection that seemed almost artistic. The ball curled with a ferocity and precision that felt preordained, whipping over the wall and into the top corner. The explosion of noise at Old Trafford was a chaotic mix of celebration, relief, and disbelief. Beckham sprinted to the corner flag, arms outstretched, completing a redemption arc so perfect it felt like cheap Hollywood writing. He was a man possessed that day. He dragged that team over the line single-handedly. The Viking anomaly. Nice. 2016. On paper, this was an accounting error. England, the inventors of the sport, possessed a population of 55 million and the richest league on earth. Iceland was a nation of 330,000 people, literally the size of Leicester, coached by a part-time dentist. When Wayne Rooney scored a penalty in the 4th minute, reality seemed secure, but the expected order of things collapsed almost immediately. Within 60 seconds, Iceland equalised via a long throw-in tactic from the 1980s that elite teams should effortlessly defend. 12 minutes later, Kolbeinn Sigthorsson's weak shot trickled through Joe Hart's wrists, 2-1. For the next 70 minutes, the most shocking aspect was the complete mental collapse of the English players. They stopped functioning. Passes went straight into touch. Professional athletes forgot how to trap a ball. They looked like terrified amateurs who had won a competition to play in the Euros. The final whistle triggered a scene that defied logic. The England manager resigned immediately and players collapsed in shame, while the Icelandic team led their fans in the Viking clap, a rhythmic, thunderous chant that sounded like a war drum. It was the biggest humiliation in England's history. They were beaten by a country the size of Leicester. The Lucas Moura miracle. Amsterdam, 2019. The narrative was already written in ink. Ajax, a team of young, homegrown prodigies, had shammed Europe. They were leading Tottenham 2-0 at halftime, 3-0 on aggregate. The countdown to the final had begun. The fans were celebrating with the joy of a team that knew destiny was on their side. Tottenham looked broken, disjointed, and devoid of ideas. Then, the entire narrative fell apart. Lucas Moura, a player known for inconsistency, suddenly became the most lethal finisher on the planet. He scored in the 55th minute, then again in the 59th. The impossible dread began to creep into the Johan Cruyff Arena. But as the clock hit the 96th minute, the final second of stoppage time, Ajax still held the advantage. Then came the long ball, the flick, the slip. Moura slashed a left-footed shot into the corner. The stadium went dead silent. The Ajax fans were absolutely gutted. The Ajax players dropped to the turf simultaneously, completely spent. They lay face down on the grass, sobbing, while Tottenham players sprinted around like lunatics. It was the cruelest finish in the history of the sport, a knife twist in the very last second that turned a fairy tale season into a horror story. A glitch in physics. Bergkamp pulled off a move most players wouldn't even attempt in training. He flicked the ball one way, spun the other, and left Debizas tackling thin air before coolly finishing. The context was a standard Premier League match. Robert Pires drilled a hard, low pass to Bergkamp, who was standing at the edge of the box with his back to the goal, marked tightly by Nikos Debizas. What happened next occurred too fast for the defender or the cameras to fully process in real time. Bergkamp didn't control the ball. He flicked it with his left foot around one side of the defender, while simultaneously pirouetting 180 degrees around the other side to meet it. It was a move that shouldn't work. The ball had backspin. The defender was physically obstructing him. Yet Bergkamp spun around the other side to meet the ball, leaving the defender swiping at thin air. Debizas fell to the ground, his legs tangled, looking like a drunk man trying to catch a ghost. Bergkamp coolly slotted the finish into the far corner. Replays were played dozens of times, and pundits still struggled to explain the mechanics of the touch. It required a level of spatial awareness that bordered on impossible. To this day, fans debate if he meant it. He says he did. The footage shows a touch so perfect, it almost looks accidental. It stands as one of the most technically incredible goals ever scored, a moment where a human being manipulated the ball in a way that seemed physically impossible. Liverpool versus Barcelona. Anfield has witnessed miracles, but the 79th minute of the 2019 semi-final felt less like a miracle and more like a tactical ambush. Barcelona, led by Lionel Messi, were footballing royalty. They were seasoned, cynical, and leading the tie comfortably just days prior. With the aggregate score tied at 3-3, the match paused for a corner kick. In the rhythm of professional football, this is a moment for defenders to organise, catch their breath, and reset the structure. The Barcelona defence turned their backs, expecting the referee's whistle or a substitution. They simply switched off. Then Alexander-Arnold spotted the opening. Trent Alexander-Arnold, walking away from the corner flag, sensed the anomaly. He spun back, striking the ball before the broadcast cameras could even track the movement. Divock Origi, standing entirely alone in the 6-yard box, swept the ball home. The stadium didn't erupt immediately. It gasped. Was it legal? Had the referee blown his whistle? The Barcelona players stood frozen, arms raised in a collective gesture of confusion, looking less like elite athletes and more like confused bystanders. To dismantle the greatest team in the world, not with a thunderbolt strike, but with a moment of schoolyard trickery, shattered the seriousness of the competition. It stands as the most surreal, cheeky, and devastating goal in Champions League history, a moment where an entire defence simply switched off for 2 fatal seconds. The Remontada. The premise of this quarter-final was a formality. Barcelona had won the first leg 4-1. They possessed Lionel Messi and a 3-goal cushion. No team overcomes that deficit against Barcelona. The Stadio Olimpico was half expecting a training exercise, but from the first whistle, Roma played with a manic, suicidal intensity that unsettled the Spanish giants. Dzeko scored early, then De Rossi converted a penalty, 2-0. The atmosphere shifted from hope to a terrifying belief. The impossible became reality in the 82nd minute. Barcelona, usually the masters of time and space, looked paralysed, completely unable to cope with the pressure. A corner kick was whipped in, and Kostas Manolas, a defender, glanced a header into the far post. The commentary from Peter Drury captured the surrealism. Roma have risen from their ruins. Manolas, the Greek god in Rome. The camera showed Messi standing in the centre circle, staring blankly, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Barcelona had been effectively bullied out of the competition by a team that refused to accept the mathematical reality of the scoreline. It was a night where sheer will dismantled superior talent, a 3-0 victory that felt like a hallucination for anyone watching. Greece's anti-football miracle. Lisbon, 2004. The European Championships are historically the property of footballing aristocracy, France, Germany, Italy. The narrative entering this tournament was focused on the hosts, Portugal, and their rising phenomenon, Cristiano Ronaldo. Greece, conversely, was a statistical afterthought, a team priced at 150 to 1 odds who had never won a major tournament match in their history. They played a brand of defensive football that was archaic, rigid, and aesthetically repulsive. Yet for 1 month, they completely defied the logic of the modern game. What made it so strange wasn't just that they won, it was the repetitive, almost mechanical nature of their victories. In the knockout stages, they defeated France, the Czech Republic, and Portugal. The scoreline was identical every time, 1-0. It felt like they had found a loophole in the sport itself. They ceded possession, absorbed pressure, and scored with their only chance. The final against Portugal was the culmination of this absurdity. The hosts had the flair, the crowd, and the talent, but the match felt inevitably pulled in Greece's direction. When Angelos Karius headed in the winner, the stadium fell into a stunned silence, usually reserved for funerals. A team with no superstars had dismantled the continent's elite without playing a single minute of exciting football. It's still the biggest upset ever. Greece parked the bus, frustrated everyone they played, and somehow nicked the trophy. The Karius malfunction. The Champions League final is the pinnacle of athletic performance, a stage where elite players typically enter a zone of hyperfocus. In Kyiv, 2018, however, Liverpool goalkeeper Loris Karius suffered a loss of focus so severe it was hard to believe it was happening in real time. Until the 50th minute, the match was a tense, tactical deadlock. Then the inexplicable happened. Karius, holding the ball with no pressure, simply rolled it onto the foot of Karim Benzema. The mistake was so amateurish that the crowd didn't even cheer. Immediately, they gasped in confusion. The nightmare only got worse. Minutes later, Gareth Bale scored a bicycle kick, a moment of surreal brilliance that deepened the dreamlike state of the match. Then came the final fracture. A speculative long shot from Bale moved straight at Karius. It was a routine catch. Instead, the ball slipped through his hands as if they weren't even there. Watching Karius after the final whistle was like watching a man wake up to find his life destroyed. He lay face down on the grass, sobbing alone, while his teammates kept their distance. Whether it was the result of a concussion, as medical reports later suggested, or crushing pressure, you couldn't believe what you were watching. You don't see mistakes that bad in Sunday League, let alone a Champions League final. A stark example of a player falling apart in front of the entire world. The Bernabeu voodoo. By the 89th minute, the analytics were conclusive. Manchester City led 1-0 on the night and 5-3 on aggregate. Real Madrid, looking lethargic and defeated, had not managed a single shot on target for 89 minutes. The television broadcast displayed a graphic probability of Man City advancing, 99%. Fans were leaving the stadium to beat the traffic. Then the stadium's legendary aura seemed to intervene. In the 91st minute, Rodrigo, a substitute, flicked in a cross, 1-1. A consolation goal, surely, but the energy in the stadium changed instantly. Before the stadium announcer could even finish shouting the name, 88 seconds later, Rodrigo rose again to head in a second. 2-1. Aggregate tied. The camera panned to the City players. They weren't just disappointed, they looked catatonic. Jack Grealish, who had missed 2 chances inches from the line moments earlier, stared into the void. In extra time, Karim Benzema scored the penalty to win it. It was absolute madness at the Bernabeu. City were in control, and then suddenly they just collapsed under the pressure of the stadium. Logic dictates that City should have won comfortably. Instead, the result simply bent to fit the myth of Real Madrid. The VAR heartbreak. Before this night, football emotions were binary. The ball hits the net, you scream, it's a goal. But the 93rd minute at the Etihad Stadium introduced a new, brutal layer to the sport. Manchester City, needing a goal to advance to the semi-finals in a chaotic 4-3 thriller, seemingly found salvation. Raheem Sterling slotted the ball home. The stadium detonated. Pep Guardiola sprinted down the touchline in ecstasy. It was the winning moment of a historic comeback. Then, the screens inside the stadium flickered. VAR check, offside. The atmosphere shifted from euphoria to a suffocating, confusing silence. The replay showed Sergio Aguero was offside by millimetres, a distance imperceptible to the human eye. The visual contrast in that moment is iconic. 1 second, Tottenham players were collapsed on the turf, weeping in defeat. The next, the referee signalled no goal, and they were suddenly back in the game. Guardiola dropped to his knees, clutching his head, looking like a man whose winning lottery ticket had dissolved in his hands. That moment completely killed the spontaneity of celebrating a goal. We watched 55,000 people celebrate a victory that hadn't actually happened, only to have it stripped away seconds later. It was the wildest emotional whiplash ever broadcast live.